IVM.
The Republic of India has incredible ambition. When the Indian Constitution came into force in 1950, it aimed to enact a social revolution, to end millennia of social discrimination, maintain religious and communal harmony, and unite hundreds of millions of Indians under one state. The fact that we have survived and thrived as a nation and as a state since then is its own testament to how much the constitutional mission has accomplished. At the same time, there's a massive mismatch between what the Indian state has ambition for and its ability to deliver on its own stated goals. The Indian state wants to end caste discrimination but fails to often uphold basic law and order. The root of this gap between the ambition and the achievement lies in state capacity. Prakhar Misra is here on the Pragati Podcast to help us understand this elusive beast. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Prakhar is an associate at the IDFC Institute in Mumbai. He was previously a Chevening Scholar doing his master's at the Chevening School of Public Policy at Oxford, and before that he studied at both the Meghand Desai Academy of Economics and at the Takshashila institution. His research focuses on data governance, infrastructure, job creation, as well as state capacity. We'll start our conversation with Prakhar after a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you are not following us on social media, please make sure you do. And it's about time that you did. So we're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Go to whichever platform you prefer or all three of them and click and follow. Also, you should check out our Instagram feed. We have a lot of interesting stuff going on over there. Peeks inside what's going on in the studio, polls, all kinds of cool stuff. So definitely come out there. I want to thank our sponsors this week, Cambly, Intel, and Storytel. Our sponsors make this stuff possible, and so please make sure that you shout out to them. Let them know that you appreciate it. One more note before we get into talking about what went on in the network this week, and that was that I would appreciate, deeply appreciate it, if you guys could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey or go to the website and click on the survey heading. And what we're going to do is we're going to do another listener survey. We'd like to know a little bit more about you, who's listening to us, why you're listening to us, what you want out of us, all of that kind of stuff. So, it would be really helpful to us if we could get a little bit of more information from you guys about who you are, and that would help us kind of go out and talk to advertisers, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, how we get this thing going. So this week we're premiering a new Hindi storytelling show. It's called Tapri Tales and it's hosted by Madhuri Advani. Madhuri narrates day-to-day stories and occurrences in women's lives across generations. This week she questions the tea-serving traditions in our house through the mother and daughter pair in her story called Chai Ki Cha. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by senior journalist and author Veer Sanghvi. He talks to Cyrus about his new book Game Changers and discusses the prominent personalities that have impacted India. They also touch upon election results and what the future might hold. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet is joined by journalist Bhanuj Kapal and co-founder of Gully Gang Entertainment, Chaitanya Kataria. Together, they talk about the hype around hip-hop in India and its cultural impact. On Filter Coffee, Karthik is joined by NBA commentator and author Akshay Manwani. In the episode, Akshay expresses his passion for classic Indian cinema, especially the works of Sahir Ludhianvi and Nasir Hussain, and discusses the evolution of the NBA in India. On Ganatantra, Dr. Ornit Shani joins Saryu and Alok to discuss the first electoral rolls, the entrenchment of democracy in India, and why, despite trying times, we must take heart. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by Dr. Mithika Kanabar. They discuss the relationship between stress and addiction. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav talks about his 6-month-long stay in Shanghai and how it changes outlook towards Chinese tourists. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ayushi and Ritasha test each other by asking 20 questions. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi Prakhar, welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Hi Pavan, lovely to be here.
It's great to be here in Mumbai at the IBM studios to record this, and I'm so happy we have a chance to sit across from each other and talk on this. We've known each other for a while since Takshashila and graduate school.
In fact, Pavan was my teacher, so officially a guru at the moment.
I was barely teaching, and it's great to see everything that you've done since then, and I'm a big fan of a lot of the work you and your colleagues are doing at IDFC Institute. So today we want to talk about state capacity, right? And it feels like a very abstract concept, and it feels like something that while a lot of people should care about it, especially when we call it state capacity, interest is lost, right? It's like net neutrality, right? It's the most soporific term in the world to describe whether the government is capable of doing what it sets out to do.
Right.
So how do we start thinking about this? Let's sort of get some definitional stuff out of the way so that, we're on level ground.
So I think in terms of, state capacity is state and the capacity of a state. So broadly, it would mean that the ability of a state to deliver on certain promises, rules, policies that it makes. And the important thing to note is that it is agnostic to the kind of promises, rules, policies that a state decides. So it's simply the ability to do it.
Right.
So a state can have a high state capacity, but still be a bad state on sort of normative parameters of judgment.
So in the sense that the idea of state capacity is not necessarily judgmental. If you have a racist apartheid state which is out to discriminate against a whole section of society, and it's able to do it well, that means it has high state capacity.
Precisely. So
right?
The German Nazi state had a high state capacity. So that's not necessarily the kind of state you want to create. Yet if you do promise poverty alleviation, clean drinking water, etc., then you do need capacity to deliver it. And that's the context in which state capacity is important to be analyzed and therefore made better. But if you would unpack the idea of a state itself, which has evolved over the years, and you've done it plenty of times on this podcast, which distinguishes itself from the idea, it begins from the idea of Plato and Aristotle talking about a polis and a city-state, and then you move on to Machiavelli and, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and finally you come to the 20th century in a very anarchist way of questioning the sovereignty of a state versus the sovereignty of an individual, and which direction does that tension go into. That this whole concept is so debatable that there is no one particular definition from an academic perspective that is largely accepted.
On state capacity.
On state capacity, but more rooted on what a state really is. So one that, people sort of kind of get to is the monopoly over violence, over a territorial jurisdiction. But that's not quite something that's very helpful when you're defining state capacity, and therefore that context of a state is not quite...
But don't you think in India that's still a good place to start from if you say that the primary function of the state is to have monopoly over violence and therefore ensure certain rights and safeties for all residents? Often in the development thinking, we miss out on sort of law and order. And if you actually don't have law and order, you can't have any kind of economic activity and development, right? If you were in Bihar from 2 decades ago and you were afraid that a family member might be kidnapped at any point, how do you run businesses? Right? If there are rifles that are just running around, country pistols going around everywhere. Right. How do you expect people to go about their lives? Why would you want to invest if it can all be snatched away overnight? So do you think it's still useful to start from there? But of course, our state has a much larger mandate than that, right? And states in the last couple of 100 years have taken on much larger mandates.
Oh, definitely. So it's something that is a starting point, but is not necessarily exhaustive in its nature. Right. It also has certain, the state's law and order is important for things like protecting property rights, rule of law, contracts. When you think of institutions as sources that create markets from a government perspective, right? Also, institutions legitimize markets, substitute markets in terms of market failures. And these are multiple roles that a state performs, which is not quite encompassed in the definition of state capacity per se. Right. But even if we were to take this minute sort of narrow view or a myopic view of state capacity in terms of just monopoly over violence, even in that, we see that India does not do very well, right? You have...
I object to monopoly over violence being called myopic, but I agree with you. No matter what you set out in India, our state is not very good at enforcing much.
No, exactly. The average of the number of... There are 144 policemen in India per 1 lakh people, which US, UK are 207, 220 odd. Argentina is way high, at around 800 or so. Police per 1,000 people across states varies a lot. So J&K will be really high, around 500 something, but you'll have Uttar Pradesh at about, I think it was 69 or something around that, right? Which is extremely low for a state of that size. So even within that myopic view of the kind of mandate that the state takes in terms of establishing law and order, we certainly don't do well.
Yeah, on the police side. And even this number hides so much, right? So even if you have only 100 odd policemen per unit population, you look at any of our cities, you look at the percentage of police in the city assigned to VIP duty.
Right.
and then you remove traffic cops aside because that's a different issue. It's traffic management. They're not even doing policing most of the time. Or rather, sometimes they do too much policing and not enough management, but they have a different role.
Right.
So actual number of beat policemen available is non-existent.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea that even within this monopoly of violence idea, like you would not just rely on the number of policemen, but even if you take the skill set or number of policemen at different levels of the IPS or of different state police forces, it does not match. So technological capabilities, for instance, are not there. I was speaking to an IPS officer and he had mentioned that the most difficult promotion to get is to go from a constable to a head constable. And if you do that, then you're through. But to get from a constable to a head constable is really difficult. And since then, I've just been generally observing, maybe it's, hindsight bias playing in, but like you see a lot of constables with white hair, and that's probably because they haven't jumped to a head constable. So ideas of autonomy, ideas of meritocracy, predictable career ladders, these are also things that come with personnel within the broad ambit of state capacity.
But now we're almost talking about sort of bureaucracy and how a bureaucracy must be imagined and can be imagined as well. Right? So, but let's maybe take a few steps back.
Sure.
We can stick to the police example or go somewhere else. But very broadly, if we say that, okay, you know what, state capacity is the state's ability to deliver whatever task it's set on for itself, whether it's security, whether it's healthcare for all, whatever goal, right? So now, if we're assuming that it's about how much capacity it takes to get there, how do we start breaking this down? How do you, I don't even want to start with measurement, but how do you think about state capacity and think about, you just want better state capacity, right? Without measuring. So where do we start thinking about it?
Right. So the idea, it's like, there are various ways to go about it, and much of it is quite sort of quasi-tautological. There are endogenities, and some of it is also just systematically obscure. But
that's a lot of very big words. Endogeneity always throws me for a spin.
I did have education in economics. Apologies. So Milan Vaishnav breaks it down into 3 P's, right? Where he talks about procedures, personnel, and paperwork. And those 3 being base elements of what state capacity could possibly be broken down into.
So that's personnel, procedures,
paperwork.
That's a very Desi definition, yes.
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, we're speaking to IAS officers on how they operate, right? And like I speak to some civil servants to get a sense of what really goes on. And it's always the case that in government, you see what has happened on the page before to do what is going to happen.
And there's a big file and it has sheets and you make a notation on the sheet.
So T.R. Raghunandan's new book actually gives a very good insight on this in terms of how the IAS operates and why is it that way and things of that sort. And given that he was an insider, it gives a very realistic account to it. But you realize that personnel is one part of the problem. It is the procedures which is the other, right? So time and again, the ease of doing business rankings, for instance, are a good metric on this front. Both IDFC Institute, where I work, does this, and even the World Bank sort of comes up with some indicators around that line. And you see that there is or even rent seeking and corruption and these ideas that come about. It's all because there is too much procedure that people can't go through. Even if you were to, like, if I jump a signal, for instance, which I'm not saying I did, but if I do, the police, I'm more likely to bribe a policeman and let me go for a bunch of reasons. A, because he's going to take the bribe, but also B, because the task of going to a court and actually getting my driving license back is just filled with so much procedures and paperwork that I don't want to do it. So streamlining services for people would be sort of an output measure of state capacity in some sense, right? Like one could look at it that way. But,
and even before that, the driving license in India has no correlation with your ability to drive.
It doesn't.
So if you are doing a licensing system, therefore the state decides, look, there's road safety is important, otherwise, there can be reckless endangerment, and therefore the state no longer has a monopoly over violence. Right? You're violent with each other with cars.
Right.
I mean, the license is of absolutely no use.
Right.
And it's a sunk cost for everyone.
Right.
Just so that they can get on the road with an ID. And the driving license biggest use is address proof and not for driving.
Exactly. And that goes on to other things. Aadhaar, for instance, the idea that you can print an Aadhaar card, laminate it, and show it on an airport as an ID proof. That's not why Aadhaar was made to begin with, right? Like, Aadhaar is supposed to be biometric in nature. And principally, UIDAI or Nandan Nilenkani, I think at that point, was opposed to giving any physical identity proof. But the reason why they did it was for political reasons. And today that has sort of eclipsed it. So I can sit on Photoshop, like sort of change Aadhaar and just sort of go and show it to the...
Yeah, and if a laminated Xerox copy of your driving license is good enough to show everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And, on driving licenses, so I know of lawyers who basically hold driving licenses of deceased drivers. So whenever there are cases of people, overrunning other people, they basically show the driving license of the deceased driver, saying that it was that driver who did it, and there is money that sort of flows around, right? So then you go to the family of that driver and sort of pay them some money and say, when the police comes for verification, say that. Like, that whole system is in place, but it's all because of this sort of procedures and paperwork that is incessant in this Indian setup.
But here, right, often I see that, especially in India, when we talk about, look, government does not work as it intended, it's all sort of lumped into corruption.
Right.
And what we are talking about right now is also corruption in various ways, and people sort of abusing the system and the rules of the game in various ways.
Correct.
But when we are thinking about what the capacity of a state is, it goes well beyond the idea of corruption, right?
Way beyond that, yeah.
So it's not just corruption that's the reason why our driving licenses are bad.
Not at all, in fact. So one could argue that a lot of scholarship has been devoted to understanding accountability institutions, and not as much as to understand how should state delivery institutions themselves should function. And all of this comes from this, sorry for the jargon, but the rational institutionalists' perspective, who assume that a state always has the capability to be predatory without questioning where does that capacity really come from. And if you were to go in with that paradigm, then it becomes logical to start thinking through what accountability institutions do you need to set up in order to curb the predatory power. But if you were to take a step back and challenge that presumption that I think largely stems from Mancur Olson's work of Logic of Collective Action and The Rise and Decline of Nations, then you would start thinking through whether a state really has the capability to be predatory or not. And simple life examples show this. I mean, I was at a signal the other day in Bombay, and a VIP convoy was passing. So they had stopped us and not allowed to go, even though the signal light was green. And people waited for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but after that they just lost it and they literally just went through. And there was no way in which the police could stop. They couldn't even single out people and actually take them to the side. And the VIP convoy had to then wait or had to be redirected. That happened. So clearly the state did not have the capability at that moment to stop the bunch of people to do what they really wanted to do. So the presumption that the state always has the power over you is not quite true. While it may be true in theory, in practice it may not always happen that way.
Fair enough. And so, and this is why sort of academic literature is littered with stuff like not just failed state, but flailing state, and there's now endless sort of clever wordplay on a bunch of these things, right? But we can understand that, say, the erstwhile government of Somalia was a failed state because they could not control territory, they could not control any kind of violence. There was pretty much everything that was going on beyond their control.
Precisely. So in terms of role of a state, we could see it in 4 broad buckets, right? 1 is law and order, 2nd is justice, 3 is revenue collection, and 4 is social service delivery. So even if there is a state that does law and order, justice and social service delivery, but is actually doing it on, IMF money, then it's not quite the state that you want it to be. And therefore, the capacity that is required there is more of a fiscal capacity rather than a police capacity.
And this is also historical, right? If we talk about how, say, Gabbar Singhs and roving bandits sort of would just come and steal money, and there were some who realized it's cleverer to do a protection racket. So you come take hafta, but then you ensure that nobody else collects hafta.
Precisely.
And that's what government is, right?
Exactly.
It's taxation. If I'm wearing Amit Verma's hat, taxation is theft. And I do agree with that idea. And so it is important that the government has the ability to even collect tax.
Right.
So that it can spend it on all the good things it's supposed to spend on.
Right.
Right? So how does this happen? So India famously is very bad at collecting tax.
That's correct.
While those who end up paying tax pay a lot of it.
Right.
Right? So if you look at just tax collection as the first thing, right? And I'd love to start there before getting into service delivery because it's endlessly complicated.
Sure.
Here we know that, okay, as a measure, how much percentage of the GDP do you get in tax?
Right.
A very nice number to work with.
Right.
And a very comparable number to work with, right? So can you give us a sense of those numbers?
Sure. So there is, in fact, I just did a paper on fiscal modernization, which is how is it that the government can modernize its tax collection systems. And the idea of modernization stems from having third-party reporting versus first-party reporting, like that kind of stuff. So if a company pays tax on your behalf or things of that sort, so that kind of streamlines it. Historically, if you see, it was war that created conditions for tax capacities to build. So World War I and World War II, for the US and UK, for instance, were extremely helpful in them building taxation capacities. And you can see their GDP rising, the tax as a percentage of GDP rising massively.
So you want to spend for war, so collect taxes. No, and that makes sense,
exactly.
right? I mean, even if you, I think, go back to the Roman Republic, you would actually privatize tax collection. This is
so that's
bizarre,
the idea of
right?
tax farming. That's right.
So you tell these guys who have thugs and have brute force, go to Sicily and collect taxes from the people of Sicily.
Right, correct.
And they do whatever it takes to collect taxes from Sicily, and they have to pay back.
Correct.
And they got to keep a cut.
Correct.
Right? So it even started sort of that way.
That's true. The one distinction I would draw here, though, is that US and UK were accountable to its citizens. So at some level, the citizens were okay in paying the extra buck to the government. And this is and so I draw a twofold conclusion in that paper that I did with my colleague, which is that what war did was created political legitimacy for the state to collect taxes. And that is something that's a doing of the war itself. Charles Tilly has a good analysis, war made state, state made war. But the political legitimacy angle fleshes out in this narrative. The second thing to which the state should be given the credit is to build its capacity and ramp up the capacity. So unlike, in the 2000s, the PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain, I think.
PIGS
countries.
Wow. Okay,
who borrowed.
That's not offensive at all.
That's the way it is. I was in Portugal, by the way. It's a lovely country. Making up for it. So those countries they borrowed money after the creation of the EU, but they spent it on revenue expenditures rather than capital expenditures. And therefore, to the credit of US and UK at that time, and right after the war, to the credit of France and Japan, who rebuilt their states on the back after coming from destruction of the war, you could give them credit to build state capacity. So it's this twofold thing. So if I were to draw this back for India, we definitely should not go to war to increase taxation collection. But what you definitely need is political legitimacy.
Right. But to go back and unpack this war and tax thing, right? So the essential difference you said from Roman and more thuggish times to the US and America was the idea that yes, you need more taxes and more government revenue for war, but you have to do it in a rule-based, law-based way and not just steal people's money and just nationalize everything.
Correct.
Right? And so
Precisely.
So you had to step up taxation, you had to set up systems to ensure that people paid the tax.
Precisely.
And I think the US and others also started things like war bonds and so on.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. In fact, the idea of VAT, value-added tax, also comes from there. Where you're collecting tax at source. So even TDS, tax deducted source, right? Like that idea comes from there, that you're trying to streamline collection of taxes, and rather than putting it on the taxpayee, you're taking the taxes at the point when the money is delivered. So there are these kinds of processes.
And that's why it's called payroll tax in the US, right?
Correct, that's what it's called.
As it's coming on your payroll,
exactly.
it sort of gets cut right there.
So there are these systems that they put in place, and well thought through systems, right, to their credit. And you can see that helping them. The other thing that helps in tax collection is exemption levels. Can't say helps, that plays a role in tax collection is exemption levels. And Thomas Piketty and Nancy Kian have done some work here where China's tax collections suddenly grow by a mile from India's, and you can see it very starkly in a graph. And that's because India's exemption levels have been moving a lot and China's weren't. I don't remember the specific numbers, but you see that trend happening. So within tax policy itself, going back to your systematizing this sort of collection and, procedures, in Millen's words, that the tax policies themselves are more profoundly catered towards building fiscal capability and capacity in those countries.
So again, to look at World War II then, so you had better taxation systems, so more tax being collected, more money being spent on war efforts, more industries being set up to produce stuff for the war effort.
Correct.
And so the government itself growing in size and employing more people and spending more.
Precisely.
And spending is difficult. Right? I mean, this is. I mean, like whether you're in government or whether you're in a grant making or funding agency or something.
Right.
When you're told to spend money but do it responsibly, it's really hard.
Of course, definitely.
Right? So at least in the war effort, they had to build their capacity, but that was you're spending on tanks, you're spending on hiring more soldiers, getting them off war, and that requires military sort of capacity.
Right.
We can leave that aside for now, right? Because that's warfare. Right. But then you have to repurpose all of that in some way, right?
Right. No,
so that you can start serving your own population, so that all the people who were employed can still be employed later.
No, correct. I think there is a role for the government to come in and spend. The one, and like thinking through this idea, there are various angles that you can take to this idea, but thinking it through from the idea of state capacity itself, I think the autonomy of a bureaucracy is what plays a role here. So there is no bureaucracy in the world that defines its own mandate. The mandate is given to it by the political establishment.
Or from heaven in China.
From heaven. So it was Max Weber who in his papers brought in this idea that for a state to grow economically, you need a good bureaucracy. And he laid down these 10 principles in some sense, measures rather, that a bureaucracy should have in order to help economic growth to take place. In the 1990s, and we'll probably come to this later, Peter Evans and James Rausch created something called the Weberian scale, coming from the idea of Max Weber, so Weberian scale, where they saw whether bureaucracies, they tested bureaucracies on two parameters. One was long-term predictable career ladders, and the second was on the scale of meritocracy that the bureaucracies had.
The idea that performance is what will result in better promotions and better escalation and so on, right?
Correct, that kind of stuff.
That though you have predictability of your career, if it happens where you just get automatically promoted every 5 years irrespective of your work, then that's a bad system.
Precisely, exactly. And they did this because it's hard to have measures of meritocratic recruitment and long-term career ladders. They took expert surveys from 35 different countries and they build a Weberian scale, and they see that it's directly correlated with economic growth of those countries. So it's fascinating to see how capacity of a state directly impacts economic growth and how Max Weber's ideas of a bureaucracy still hold today.
So countries where civil servants were promoted based on ability and performance, and who were not willy-nilly shunted because of politics and for other reasons, generally did better.
That's correct. I think the way they did it was they had a questionnaire of 10 questions and they did this over 3 years in the 1990s. So, like technology wasn't as advanced then and stuff like that. And their questions were, like among graduates of a country's most elite university, is public sector a career considered to be A, the best possible option, B, a second best option, 3, it depends on the circumstances. Things of that sort.
Right.
And so these are largely a qualitative assessment of such surveys, but it does indicate that the strength of a bureaucracy directly leads to economic growth. So to answer your question in terms of how do you define spending, etc., I think it's largely correlated with the kind of mandate the bureaucracy gets. Right. So if a government tells you buy an aircraft, versus if a government tells you buy an aircraft for so much seating capacity, versus if a government tells you buy an aircraft of this engine type of so many seating capacity. So you could go into the sort of nitty-gritties of the details and take away autonomy of the bureaucracy to make those decisions, and have a large political interference which may impact spending massively, because then you go into these procedural issues which bureaucracy is very famous for.
And even if this is not necessarily from the political or from the elected reps,
right,
if just rules are made at a very high level from the higher bureaucracy,
right,
and say thou shalt all only buy this particular type of refrigerator in all office thing.
Right.
I remember a district collector talking to me a while ago about how he was having trouble taking certain decisions in the time of, CAG, RTI and other sort of action. And he was saying, look, there's a district hospital in my district.
Right.
And I need to buy an MRI machine.
Right.
Now, I can go for the base model 1 Tesla MRI machine, which will do a good job, it will satisfy, it will work. Or I can go for whatever is the latest model, which is still reasonable, which is 2.5 times the cost. It's a 5 Tesla model or 2 Tesla model with more functions and bells and whistles, and might serve a longer period or have more utility. How do you choose? Right? How do you do? You can't even do a rigorous cost-benefit analysis or something. It's very hard to do.
There's no way to do that.
And his fear was, if I choose wrongly, incorrectly, then I'm in trouble.
This is still a very complex decision to make, right? I'll give you a more mundane example. That Arun Shourie, who was this investment minister in the Vajpayee government, he's got this really good book. I'd urge everyone to read it, Governance and the Sclerosis That Is Set In. I think it's out of print though, but you'll have to go to Blossoms and get a second-hand copy, because that's the only way you'll find it.
Okay.
But he talks about this example of an IAS officer, a junior level IAS officer, brought in this idea or brought in this question of what color of ink of the pen he can use to write on the file. Is green allowed? Something around those lines. And this went on and on for 2 years, for 3 years within the government. And they finally, when they came out with an answer to this, it was so specific that this code, BIS marked, it just went into such detail, such level of detail, that it's now practically impossible to write it with any other pen. So,
wow.
So that's, MRI machines, it's hard, but ink pens shouldn't be that hard, right? Like, do red, do black.
Write in a way that doesn't blotch. Write in a way that when you photocopy it, it looks fine, right? That's the outcome that you're going for.
Exactly. But it's instructive to see how incentive compatibility issues within the government can create problems. And this is also some place where I think academia falls short, because ideas of public choice, for instance, like principal agent problems, etc., don't quite fit well in a government, because in the government there are too many principals and too many agents at the same point in time. So everybody is in subordination to someone, but also at a level of seniority to someone else.
Right.
So, and that person would be wearing 2 hats simultaneously, and therefore to actually cull out who's the principal and who's the agent in a particular transaction is hard. And specifically when everybody is acting on everybody else's behalf and nobody's really acting on their own, which is
while they have their own self-interest.
Which is the, constant problem in the government. And I feel...
So you're saying it's hard to study this to make any meaningful conclusions.
Correct.
But more bigger picture, right? So how do we, one thing I remember... Is it Francis Fukuyama who was talking about this idea that, look, you can have certain agencies that are not terribly competent.
Right.
And they might have different amounts of autonomy given to them.
Right.
Like, for example, you're a water supply company, but you don't get to decide what your rates are, how much you bill the citizens.
Right.
You don't get to decide when to lay a new pipeline.
Right.
All that approval has to come from above.
Right.
You do this job.
Right.
And then there's this idea that if there is somebody who's more competent, a water supply company in a city which has its own planners, hydrogeologists who can understand groundwater and so on.
Right.
If you actually give them more autonomy, empower them more, they can actually take far better decisions on their own than you could sitting from up on high.
Completely.
But if you have this incompetent or barely competent
exactly.
water supply company, like most of ours are,
Correct.
then you have to dictate rules. Otherwise, people will run willy-nilly, divert funds, ultimately not serve the public and therefore not contribute to state capacity.
Completely agree. So, and I mean, to phrase it in a more generic word, like I think state capacity is relational in its approach, in the sense that it depends on what you apply it to, and it needs to be morphed to the subject.
Right.
So exactly.
And here there is that tension between how much autonomy do you give someone and how competent they are.
Exactly.
Right? You want to give more rules to someone who can only follow the rules.
Precisely. So you want to give autonomy only when the service can be delivered. And there are... The thinking around this has evolved to some degree. So Land Pritchett, for instance, makes this distinction between discretionary and transaction-intensive services, where you have some services where you don't need many people to make a decision, like setting an interest rate for the country. And that can be done by, 4 people, 5 people, 10 people sitting in a room. And that's when skill set becomes much more important than have they really gone through the bureaucracy or, like things of that sort.
So you need a bunch of empowered top people at the Reserve Bank of India,
exactly,
who can collectively decide,
exactly,
and who have their own research teams perhaps to support them.
Precisely. And that is where you don't probably need political interference, and you want to keep that away. On the second hand, he talks about the other services which is transaction intensive, like delivering a midday meals program to kids, right, where there's a lot of face-to-face contact between people, and that's where you need institutions of accountability to come into the picture, etc. So if you start applying institutions of accountability to services that are discretionary in nature, then you're kind of defeating the purpose itself.
Right. But let me see if I got this right.
Yeah.
So by accountability, you mean, so say the Reserve Bank of India and it's, I don't know, the deputy governor or the board or somebody decides, okay, this is the interest rate.
Right.
And it's a bad decision, right? And say it hurts the economy. It's happened often enough. They are notionally accountable in that, they may not get an extension, their performance will be judged by the public and by the government in some way.
Correct.
But it's not like there's direct penalty because they took a wrong decision.
Precisely.
Because you're almost reading the tea leaves also there.
Exactly.
Right? Things may work, may not work.
Exactly.
But if somebody is delivering a midday meal scheme and there is something toxic in it and you are causing harm to children,
right,
you better fire that person. Or, if the offense is grave enough and it's criminal neglect, you jail the person. Or you have some system whereby this gets corrected immediately and there is punitive or corrective action.
Correct. And public recourse. So the structure of accountability institutions itself would change depending on the institution that is being accountable, right? Otherwise, it's going to become counterproductive. And this is where you can't directly import ideas that have worked to ideas in places where in places where there's a lack of institutions. So again, Pritchett again here, where he says he's got a paper which is actually titled "Solution When the Solution is the Problem," and the solution is actually a well-functioning bureaucracy. So he's saying that there is a land which is Denmark, and then there's another country which is Djibouti. Now you can't just simply pick up what works in Denmark and put it to Djibouti, because it will not work there. So this idea of what he calls skipping straight to Weber comes from the Weberian bureaucracy that we discussed earlier, is somewhat counterproductive if you don't take local context into account.
Right. So if you have nothing and then you have this ideal bureaucracy that's in your mind, you can't get there.
Yeah, you can't get there.
And
exactly.
You actually create a monster in the place of that.
Precisely. So capability of the state needs to be judged before you start, sort of putting in institutions in play there.
So could you sort of help us unpack maybe a few Indian examples where you think whatever the state capacity might be, it's increased on whatever thing, either taxation or service delivery? So
clearly, I mean, if we interpret taxation also in terms of technology being helpful, I think that there have been massive improvements. So for instance, transparency has increased. So I was looking up some state budgets. Interestingly, the difference in what they budget estimate is and what they actually get is pretty wide across all states. Andhra Pradesh, I think, averages in terms of total revenue a difference of about 37%, which is pretty huge. So I was just speaking to some officers in the government, and
imagine that if you do that in a private company, you're projecting that your cost is going to be 1 crore and your income is going to be 1 crore, and you get only 60 lakhs. You're finished. You don't get to go to next year.
Exactly.
But governments can.
They can. So in that, the officers were saying that technology has helped them bridge this gap, and therefore instituting systems has made it better for them to understand these things. The other thing, which is like implementation of a nationwide scheme like Aadhaar, for instance. In another paper I did, I said Aadhaar is great. I mean, Aadhaar has its problem. So it's the analog components of digital systems, right? Which is the legislation behind it, the public grievance redressal process behind it, which is problematic. But the digital system itself makes sense. And Aadhaar has massively helped improve the capacity of a state to deliver services. Direct benefit transfers, for instance. So these are some improvements that have happened which help in many ways in helping the bureaucrats align their incentives, while at the same time reducing transaction costs of a government and helping them save their overheads as well.
So the whole Rajiv Gandhi era idea of every rupee spent on
15
the public
15 paise
distribution
reaches
system.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
And so
even if that 15 becomes 30, that's
exactly
doubled the capacity. That's a very bad way of putting it. But
but there's certainly an improvement that you see. One can argue what the improvement should have been, and where India should have been by now, etc. But you see a growing increase in people's responsibilities towards the state itself. Just, even within the administrative services, I think the graph, there is a chapter in Rethinking Public Institutions in India by K.P. Krishnan and T.V. Somanathan, who have charted out the history of the IAS, the recent history of the IAS, and the graph shows that from 1990 to 2002, the intake drops suddenly.
Okay.
And then it starts increasing post 2002, and then it stabilizes until 2006, and then it shoots up again. So you see this again as an improvement in personal absorption within the government. That said, vacancy rates are still high.
So this is happening at a time when the Indian population is growing by like 100 million or 200 million or more every decade. Right?
Yeah, that's correct. So
where urbanization is happening rapidly, you have cities that are growing, and you actually don't even have the same number of IAS officers going in.
Precisely. So that's the reform that has not happened, which is restructuring of rural local bodies and urban local bodies in proportion to growing urban spaces, because they have significantly extra powers if you are an urban local body. But if you are classified as a rural local body over an urban region, just because it hasn't happened yet, that's problematic. So population increased from 800 odd million to 1.2 billion between 91 and 2011. Personnel within government actually dropped in that time from 19 odd million to 17.5 million or something of that sort.
And this is sort of union and state governments combined. Okay. First of all, the government actually does not know how many people employs, right? I mean, if you're talking about state capacity, no government, be it the Bangalore city government or the state government of Karnataka or the union government of India, knows how many employees it has on its payroll.
That's correct. I'm fairly certain, if you ask them that, they will not answer that question because it's just going to be hard to come up with that number.
No, and one of the things I remember hearing in person as well is they can tell you how many people they paid last month. So in that sense, they have a rough idea of payroll. But there might be other people who are on the staff but not paid in that last payroll or are paid differently.
Yeah.
And the governments have various ways, right? So you can be a state government employee, or you can be a contract worker.
Right.
Or you can be an ASHA worker who gets an incentive and not even a contract wage, right? I mean, that's the government labels anything they pay ASHA workers as incentives.
Correct.
So like almost like an ex gratia payment, right? It's something else.
That's correct.
But functionally, you're paying people for their time to do services for the government.
And that's massively problematic because one problem is personnel absorption. The other problem is personnel allocation. So there would be services where you need more people to deliver, but then you just wouldn't know how many people are there, and therefore how do you really restructure it, right? And that compounded with the incentive incompatibility idea that we talked about. Nobody wants to be innovative in government, and then how do you sort of get that done? So these are issues. In fact, even the bureaucracy itself is quite heavy on the bottom but light on the top. So this is what Ruben keeps talking about, which is that on the top you have like when you'll have a lot of people as section officers, etc. But as and when they're promoted, the people who are actually making decisions are few and far between. And I think the strength of the Indian IAS and IPS combined is about the 1/5 of that of the United States. And considering our population is way more than that, we may probably have to start thinking through improvements.
Right. And even there, right? Even if you have the best IAS officer out there, the most talented, well-trained, knowledgeable, have experience, if their support staff is weak, and often it's support staff and at that level itself which often has holes, right? I mean, like, if you're not supported by enough people, there's a hard limit on how much you can do. It's like having a great CEO but no good CXOs reporting to that person, right?
Correct.
So, Prakhar, let's take a quick break and we'll come back. Let's talk a little more about, how we can actually start improving state capacity in India. I think we've gotten a rough idea of various aspects of it. It is an elephant which a lot of us blind people are trying to sense.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, whatever measurement you throw aside, we have to improve how the government of India and states work.
Right?
So let's do that after a quick break.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amar Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm Pavan Srinath and I'm here with Prakhar Misra and we're talking about state capacity. So, Prakhar, we've been trying to identify this beast and sort of get a sense of the shape and size of it in the first 2/3 of this show. And sort of in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about, okay, this is the beast and we only know so much of it, but we all agree that we need to improve state capacity, right? So how do we go about doing that? Especially for India, how do we go about making our state just better at doing good stuff?
I think we have more clarity on what we should not do than what we should.
And that's usually how it works. So what shouldn't we do?
So the first thing is what we alluded upon earlier, which is this blind mimicking or copying of institutions that have worked elsewhere, and to try and do that here. Land Pritchett distinguishes this European regulators versus Indian regulators in terms of there is a rule-based world and ours is a deals-based world. And therefore, the way we look at setting up our systems needs to be fundamentally different than the way we look at.
And then there's this ideal of a principles-based world.
Which doesn't exist in government.
But that's what's talked about,
correct,
right?
correct,
Principles-based regulation rather than rules-based regulation, especially when things like technology and so on are changing so randomly.
Exactly.
So you want to have a do no harm type sort of mandate.
Exactly.
But very intelligent and non-corrupt and ideal people who will interpret this in the perfect manner,
right.
which doesn't work.
So
we're not even at rules, we're at the deal stage. Okay. So, but I get this, but thankfully, this has died down in the last few years, but the amount of sort of Scandinavian envy that was there in India, in Denmark or in Norway, they do it this way, they have healthcare for all.
Right.
Do you really think you can import that to India when we're earning $2,000 per person?
Yeah, exactly. I think prioritization of issues is a problem. And
copying the solutions.
And copying the solutions, of course. So if you, they're like sort of interlinked at some level, that you forget what you actually want to solve for and actually just start looking at solutions and blindly importing them because they worked elsewhere. And this has been given different names, right? So Shruti Rajagopalan and Alex Tabarrok, I think, wrote a paper which also echoed the sentiment. And it's called isomorphic mimicry, institutional monocropping, bunch of these terms that broadly
institutional monocropping. I like that. But unfortunately, the positive language used is, what are the best practices? Let's adopt the best practices.
Yeah, let's adopt the best practices.
They may be very bad practices for you, right? But this best practices language.
Yeah.
It's there everywhere, especially in local government.
Precisely. And it assumes that there is a best practice that will work everywhere, agnostic to local context, right? And this also goes back to what we were speaking earlier, which is there is not enough, how should I call it, innovation capability within the bureaucracy, right? Because you're stifling that is why they're just looking at what has worked and sort of importing that. But if you look at successful bureaucracies, what they actually have is agents who innovate at the front line and try and sort of systematize that.
So you're the old joke, right? Like, get me the technology to build the fastest internet speeds in the world. And then the bureaucrat asks, okay, but can you show me a precedent for that? Right? You can't.
Exactly.
So one, we have to avoid stifling innovation. We have to avoid copying things.
We have to avoid copying things.
What do we actually do?
So to begin with, I think one is building a broader knowledge base within the government. So to have support staff that are qualified, that are capable of delivering policy solutions. So have proper research teams, for instance, before you start.
Because a lot of people have, I mean, we have great administrators and managers in government.
Exactly.
Right? But we don't necessarily, the government has an assumption that it knows how things are and what will work.
Right.
But both are extremely flawed assumptions.
Extremely flawed.
The hubris was the central planning, but still that survives in some level, right?
In many ways, actually. And to some degree, maybe there might be a small component of policy making where central planning is better off. But by and large, you need, Hayek talked about it and won a Nobel Prize for it. So little to say on this front, but by and large you need information that is scattered to come together and then help in planning and policy making and things of that sort. So research teams, diversity of knowledge that people bring. So somebody remarked that at least within the tech policy space there is an overbearance on lawyers but not technologists, for instance, themselves, right? So computer scientists don't quite engage with the debate, and those are the guys who know how data sort of works.
And honestly, till date, on topics like net neutrality, I honestly don't know anyone who knows all aspects of net neutrality in a good way. How do you treat data? There's data that's locally cached,
right?
So that if you or your internet provider is using that material often, you can actually access it closer. It's such a complex field that I still don't understand the tech aspects of net neutrality. But this is something that people are already passing legislation on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's essentially why you need a more qualified team within the government. So it's not to say that it doesn't happen. The government started something called I think it's ongoing right now, the National E-Governance Division, which is there, which sort of assists in such policy making. They recently came out with the India Enterprise Architecture and such schemes. But you need a lot more to happen on this front.
Currently you also have things like, there's a Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council.
Right.
So you have economists who directly sort of
with the Prime
provide certain things, and that can influence policy in various ways. We also have the Niti Aayog now, which is supposed to be a government think tank, although Niti Aayog does quite a few things.
Right.
And but apart from this, there have been a few ideas that have been floated around recently, right? There's this idea of a fiscal policy council, I think, that the 14th Finance Commission recommended. It's very much like the Congressional Budget Office in the US. Right? So you need, if the government or whoever comes up with schemes saying we will, promise a laptop for all, favorite from a while ago. Right. You need somebody to be independently costing the thing and saying, hey, this is what this will cost. Right. And this is information that the legislature and the public have a right to know.
Yeah, definitely. And this kind of work in terms of from within the government has already been done. So Dr. Kelkar has a report called the Ministry of Finance for the 21st Century, which came way back in 2004, if I'm not wrong. And that had a bunch of things on how you restructure the Ministry of Finance. I mean, that report also had things like have high-speed internet and proper office space and stuff like that. Some of those problems may have already been resolved by now.
Sure.
But essential point being build a broader knowledge base within the government. Also goes back to, Nicholas Taleb's point of having skin in the game. So if you do have, one can argue that you're doing this through external consultants, etc. But those are folks who don't bear the brunt in some sense, or of consequences of the policy projections that they do. So it might just be helpful to try out this kind of a model.
Right. But do it in a way that you don't surround yourself with yes men.
Exactly. So
right?
That's the danger.
If you have
here.
Research that feeds whatever conclusion that you want to solve,
right.
or you want to arrive at, that's not research.
Right. So the advantage of having consultants is that, right? Like they're free thinking in the sense that they're...
Consultants are free thinking? Are you and I in the same world?
Free thinking in the sense that they're not, their next month's salary does not depend on, or where they're working does not depend on the politician,
True.
right? Like, so they won't pander.
But you know the joke, right? I mean, not to disparage anyone who does consulting. I also do some, but the idea is you give a consultant the watch so that he can tell you the time. Right? I mean, that's very disparaging, but I get your point. You want an inside staff who's not necessarily going to take everything and make it public, but who gives you critical feedback.
Exactly,
right?
that kind of stuff.
So you need the slave on the emperor, on Caesar's chariot whispering in his ear. You are still mortal.
Right. And that stuff exists, except that stuff, in like, to take off from your analogy or from your joke, has the watch but can't see the time. So you need people who can.
And we need it at multiple levels, right?
Exactly.
Sure, the Prime Minister is equipped with quite a few things. The government of India has quite a few things.
Right.
We have national regulatory bodies that have good staff. You have the Competition Commission, which has its own expertise.
Right.
But say, what do you have at the state level?
Exactly.
What do you have at the city level?
Right.
Which is a thinking agency in any Indian city,
right.
which works in the government.
Precisely. And policy making is probably one of the hardest things to do, because what you're fundamentally trying to do is influence public behavior in a manner that helps in collective problem solving, right? So you see the state as solving collective action problems. And what you then have to start project is how will people not only behave today, but how will they behave tomorrow, and what will happen in the interim when the policy is passed, etc. So I would additionally also say that what the government needs is some sort of a futures thinking unit within when it's trying to build this knowledge base.
And the US, I'm amazed by this always. They have the White House National Intelligence Committee and so on. There are certain people whose job it is to look at the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Some whose job is 5 to 30 years.
Right.
And some whose explicit job is only 30 years and beyond. Anything within 30 years is not within their mandate.
Right.
That's nuts, especially out of India.
In fact, I don't know which country, I can't remember clearly, Sweden or Switzerland, they had a minister of the future or something.
I think Finland.
Yeah.
So it's a nice title.
Yeah.
So you have this. So this is largely about knowledge in government, right?
Right.
But knowledge is still different from training.
Correct. So, and that's the second order and a bigger problem that needs to be resolved, which is building capacity in the sense of skill sets at a subnational level. So you do have trainings for IAS officers, but at state level officers who do a lot of the work, right? I mean, health, for instance, is a state subject. Those officers need to be trained as rigorously, if not more, than the ones who are a part of the national cadre.
Right. And state-level training institutions are the punishment postings for various people.
Exactly.
Right? So if there is a state institute for urban development
right.
or rural development and so on.
Exactly.
That's a post you get when you don't have a large budget and a department to command, and that's really, really sad.
Either that or they're non-existent. So there's no sort of a superlative way for a person to perform at the moment. So training of state-level bureaucrats, officers is extremely important. Because these are the people who are making the budgets that are then going at the center, and then in the increasing sort of realization of federalism that India is going through, you want local level frontline sort of officers to have a lot deeper and nuanced understanding so that they can feed back into policy making.
Right. And that knowledge of the ground is far better than anyone sitting in New Delhi.
Exactly. And which is the problem in terms of the planning problem that we talked about earlier, right? So you have asymmetry of information throughout the chain that is not going back through some feedback loops. And part of it is because of the lack of processing capabilities in a language that can help policy making. So capacity building.
Training is a big bucket.
Right.
What else do you think India, especially at this point, should be thinking hard on?
So using technology, because Aadhaar, for instance, has helped massively. The tax network, tax information network, I think, which has really helped sort of tax collections. In terms of submitting your income tax, now you don't know which officer is going to, see through your file, so you can't bribe them directly because it goes randomly to people to check. So these are the kind of systems that technology can do, and these are very cost effective. The technology exists. This is where I think...
And it has been adopted. Like, for example, I think in the 2000s, along with the economic growth, the amount of gains we made in taxation is what allowed the government to expand significantly.
Exactly.
Right? And that was fragile after 2008.
Right, exactly.
But what, for a period, there was like 20-25% growth in tax every year, right? Insane.
Right.
And unfortunately, people took it for granted.
Right, yeah.
And then reality...
Yeah, no, it's almost 20%, I think. But there's a downside to this in the sense that, so after Aadhaar, they created something called state resident data hubs at a state level, where they could use the biometric data to weed out fake beneficiaries. And the states realize that this might be increasingly helpful to them. So states like Andhra Pradesh and Telangana have passed their own acts. They collect their own biometric data, and they've literally mapped out all data points of a citizen in front of them. And in the lack of legislative, right to privacy, and like this happened before the right was passed, before the judgment was passed, there's some sort of a danger here. And therefore, to find that balance is what is key. But more technology will be helpful in delivering services and building state capacity for sure.
Right. And not all of that technology is necessarily citizen facing, right? A lot of that can be internal as well.
Definitely.
So, and won't have the kind of privacy and other trade-offs that we have with Aadhaar and related things.
Precisely. So, I mean, data like GIS mapping, for instance, which is satellite data, that data is not personal in and of itself. It's not personal data. I mean, of course, you can combine it with other data sets and try and uniquely identify individuals. But in and of itself, if used judiciously, it will sort of give you insights. The one thing, though, that is the most obvious one is just recruiting more people for the government, right? Like within the government.
Easiest thing in the world.
Easiest thing in the world. Like the vacancies of judges. I mean, I think the judiciary has some 16,000 odd judges and 3.3 crore pending cases at the moment, which is like huge, right? And the Law Commission has said about 70,000 judges are needed. So how do you go from 16,000 to 70,000? Even at state levels, there's a lot of disparity. Andhra Pradesh, I think, has a 70% vacancy rate of high court judges. So, I mean, these are things that you can do, again, provided you have the fiscal...
But they're quite hard to do, right? If you actually want to get qualified people in that number... One, where do you have the money for it?
Exactly.
Because when you are actually hiring a new employee of the government, you are looking at the lifetime cost of that individual.
Exactly.
Which, unfortunately, governments often don't do. Right? I mean, you have to look at full service emoluments and then pensions.
No, of course. I mean...
and all the other benefits that government jobs get.
There is a high burden of high cost burden and to find qualified people that certainly exists. But yet there needs to be a way in order to meet these. So you have to ration out other expenditures to try and channel in money in here and find out new and innovative ways in order to bridge this gap. Like this is something that's a non-negotiable in many ways. And I mean, India, it should be, it's not salient to us directly, but we're like almost 18% of the world's population. So anything and everything like that goes on here impacts like a large chunk of people. And service delivery, judiciary, police, I mean, these are basic functions that definitely need to be
So one way is to actually look at certain priority areas and say, okay, here let's figure out how to relax the rules or create a new system such that we can recruit more, at least on priority, even if, doing that across the board is hard, right? In that sense, it's a little bit like Paul Romer's charter city idea, right? You ring fence something and then you play with the rules there.
Right.
Here you ring fence perhaps a domain
and
have fundamentally different recruitment procedures and so on.
Correct. And
I think there's been some evolution among some states, right? Like, for example, there are still many states in the country where all your government hospitals are sort of run by the line health department and the local branches of the health department. Whereas, say, a state like Karnataka, all these hospitals, the major hospitals, will be independent trusts
Right.
which the government gives grants to for salaries, for capital, for everything.
Right.
But then they have the ability to recruit independently.
Right.
So you again delegated function.
Right.
Said you figure out your rules. Here are our guidelines.
Right.
You do it.
Right.
And there is some accountability.
Yeah, and like amongst all of these sort of solutions that we've talked about, they aren't separate from each other, right? Like there are complementarities that can be leveraged. And if you do have a well-trained state-level bureaucracy, there's a chance that your recruitment levels may not sort of, need to go as high as global numbers are. If you do have more technology in the government, you can reduce transaction costs in terms of personnel, shifting files and things of that sort.
Yeah, and we've seen this especially with the armed forces, right? Because you've seen even China has scaled down on its the size of the army, and the idea is that if you have better equipped and trained soldiers, one soldier can replace 3.
Right.
And we are at a stage where I think our defense pensions bills is 100,000 crores and more.
It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a full quarter of everything we spend in defense. And basically what that means is we are still paying for Bangladesh and Kargil and other things. Right? Because people who served are getting their pensions.
Right.
But to do that requires a lot of courage. Especially in the lines of how it's said in Yes Minister, right? That's a very courageous decision.
Completely. I mean, even though it sounds like something that is extremely salient and it makes the government sound very dwarfed and ineffective, it needs to be acknowledged that it's not the first time one is talking about hire more people. It's just hard to do for a variety of reasons that may or may not be known to the outside world. So this in fact takes me back to something at Takshashila that in one of the classes was the $10 bill test, right? Which is if there is a $1 bill on the road, a $10 bill on the road, and I ask you to pick it up, you're basically going to say it can't be, and if I ask why, you'll say if it was, somebody would have picked it up earlier. And that's the idea to, like why hasn't the change happened till now, and to really unpack those causes in order for you to then effect change is what is important. And this is where these, theoretical frameworks around state capacity, etc. are still developing.
Right. And even here we've talked about the what and not necessarily about the how. Exactly. And my sort of final thought on this is, I think in India, we just need to have a larger and larger appetite for reform and the belief that it is possible, right? Because I think there were things that happened that we've forgotten and now feel like the reform's not possible. In the late 90s was sort of the biggest layoff, if you will, of public sector employees, which are the banks. And I think we managed it pretty well with computerization coming in and not as many bank personnel required. Yeah. There's this whole idea of a golden handshake. So you do spend money on it, but you will save in the long run, and you don't betray the trust of employees, and you give them an option. And it, I think, was one of the most successful examples of a government sector downsizing, restructuring in the light of new technology and reorienting how it works. And for all the faults of the banking sector today, I think this is something that was managed reasonably well.
Yeah, and I mean, you can take this example even in the recent past with the Jan Dhan Yojana, etc. that was largely technology based because people did not have identification systems and they finally got the Aadhaar. Yet there are issues with it, there are problems with it. But the one thing is that it is moving forward, which is essentially what is bolstering the belief in some sense. It's just that the how do you do question is the hard one because it's hard to academically conceptualize it. So unlike, a neat equation of GDP where you can move one thing up and the other thing moves down in order to balance it out, you don't have that at a local level. So you certainly don't have that at a national level when you're talking about the functioning of a government. And the other problem, or can't say problem, complexity that comes in is because you have so many disciplines that are interlinked here. So there is politics that needs to be managed. There is organizational design. There is the economics of it all. Hard budget constraints that governments face in terms of personnel.
But we can bucket this all away as political economy issues. But you're absolutely right. I think the how of it is something that, honestly, I think we need to spend a lot more time talking on. And I hope that on the Pragati podcast, both you'll come back and we'll have more episodes on the how.
Yeah, I'm
and not just the what and the why, but the how.
And I'm hoping to try and reorient these ideas towards the how. So in not too far in the future, we'll probably sit again and chat about it more constructively.
I'm looking forward to it. And I'm not saying that what we did today was not constructive. I take umbrage in that. Prakhar, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Pavan. Lovely to be here as well.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue and gossip and instead focus on the data, research and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।